So the Gemara that we learned yesterday mentioned the two different opinions as to the creation of man. Was the creation of man including man and woman, male and female, or was man created as a man with an extra organ, which the Gemara uses the term zanov, which could mean, generally means tail, but it could mean here just an extra organ, which from that organ, God created Eve, a female. So in other words, was Adam and Eve were they both created complete and all God needed to do was divide them? Or was really just Adam created with an extra little organ that became that organ? From that organ, God created Eve. And the Gemara had mentioned, according to the opinion, that it was both of them were created and they were one entity. In other words, they were back to back, male and female. And wherever one went, the other one had to obviously go along, like Siamese twins. The question the Gemara had was, so who went first? Gemara said, must be that Adam went first because we have a rule that it's not appropriate. And we have a brisa that says this rule, that a man should not go after a woman on their way. So meaning that if a woman is in front, then it's a problem for a man to follow. And the reason for that has to do with having negative thoughts that a person will have if they watch a woman walking. They will stare at her body movements and at her body shape and so on. And this could be, this is inappropriate, and it's could lead to improper thoughts, impure thoughts, which ultimately could lead to adultery. And the Gemara then says, even a person's wife, a man shouldn't walk behind his wife. And the reason for that is it's not proper etiquette. And the Jewish way would be for the man to walk in front. And definitely not behind his wife. The Gemara then mentions that if they're on a bridge, he should have her move to the side, and this way he could pass in front of her. And if a person does walk behind a woman, when she is going along the shore, along the river, when she is going in the river, if he walks after her, it says he doesn't have a portion in the world to come. And the reason for that is that she picks up her clothing so that they don't get wet or soaking wet when she's walking through this little river. And so if he's walking behind her, if he's looking at her body, he's able to see her, and her clothing is lifted up. And so he does not get a portion in the world to come. Now, Tosfos tells us that this means that he habitually is doing these type of things. In other words, it's not just from a one-time transgression of looking at a woman, but it's if he's if he's often doing this, it'll lead to ultimately it'll lead to adultery, and ultimately he will end up going through Gehenna. Now, the Gemara then mentions that along the same lines, there's another brisa, and the brisa says that if a person counts money or changes money, or gives change to a woman from his hand to her hand, if he does it in order to gaze at her, so even if he has a lot of Torah and good deeds, similar to Moses, he will not be cleansed from needing to go through hell, from Dina Shel Gehenna. He will end up having to go through hell, as it says, Yad liyad lo yanake ra, that the Gemara understands to mean that yad liyad, even if he's like Moshe Rabbeinu, who received the Torah hand to hand, meaning from Hashem's hand to his hand, he will not be cleansed of his sin, of his evil, and meaning he won't get cleansed from needing to go to hell. And the point of this Gemara is along the same lines as the previous Gemara, that he is gazing at a woman, and ultimately, one of the things people don't realize is that it's not only a sin to commit adultery, but there's also a sin to have impure thoughts. The mitzvah in the Torah that we say in Shema is v'lo yisasuru acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem. Person should not go after the thoughts of the what their eyes see. After their heart's desires, and after what their eyes see. So if a person has a impure thought, he's supposed to push it aside and think something positive. One of the ways around this problem is if you keep your mind busy. If you're always busy thinking good things, pure things, Torah thoughts, you won't have time. When the mind is empty, that's when impure thoughts come in. If you're bored, it's a terrible thing to be bored. And so the trick of not having impure thoughts often is from keeping your mind busy and keeping yourself busy with mitzvahs, and there's no time to think of impure thoughts. But ultimately, everyone does, the evil inclination finds his way into our minds, and the job of ours is not to get depressed and say, oh, why did that evil inclination come to my mind? Why did that thought come to my mind? That thought came to your mind from the evil inclination, and that's not your fault. It's only your fault if you dwell on it, if you meditate on it, if you immediately push it aside, think something else, then you have fulfilled the mitzvah of v'lo yisasuru acharei levavchem, not to go after your heart's desires and after the things that your eyes see. So the Gemara here is emphasizing that idea, and it's mentioning it with regard to either walking after a woman or specifically choosing a certain woman to change your money, and then this way you have a few moments to enjoy gazing at her, and that is inappropriate. And now the Gemara says that Rav Nachman says that Manoach was an Am Haaretz. He was a ignoramus. And why does the Gemara think that he was an ignoramus? Based on this same idea, because the verse, the pasuk in Shoftim, it mentions that Manoach walked after his wife. Vayelach Manoach acharei ishtay. He walked after his wife. So we see from there that Manoach went against this brisa. So the Gemara says he must have been, now Manoach, who is Manoach? Manoach is the father of Shimshon Hagibor, the father of Samson. And the Gemara is mentioning here that we see from this is the famous story where the angel came and spoke to Manoach's wife, and he came a second time, and his wife went to get Manoach to come to the field to see for himself, because initially it was only the wife who spoke to the angel, and Manoach was not was left out, and the angel had given all these rules to his wife about how your son is going to be a Nazir oil. Shimshon was a Nazir, and she's not allowed to different foods that they can't have. Even the mother wasn't supposed to have it, and the child, and so on. And so basically, Manoach wanted to hear the rules clearly. So the angel came back to her. So she ran inside to the house from the field to get Manoach. Manoach came out and he went after his wife. So the Gemara says, you see from there, he was an Am Haaretz. Now Rashi tells us Am Haaretz means that he was not Mishamesh Talmidei Chachamim, because he didn't serve the scholars, because he didn't learn this Mishnah. He obviously never learned it. So he was ignorant. And the Gemara says, you bring a proof from this verse that he was ignorant, he did something wrong. We find a similar verse about Elkanah, the father of Shmuel Hanavi. We find a similar verse about Elisha, who went after the Isha Hashunamis, the woman who her son had died, and Elisha revived him. So that story, it mentions a similar verse. Tosfos mentions that it doesn't. That the other verse about Elkanah, we don't find such a verse in the Psukim. So it seems to be maybe a mistake that that creeped into the Gemara, that there was a verse about Elkanah walking after his wife, but with Elisha, we do find this verse, and it says he went after her. Sounds like the same thing as the story of Manoach. So it must mean he didn't go after her, or walking after her, behind her. That's not proper etiquette. It's not. Means that he went after her advice or after her words. And if so, the same thing would be Manoach. It says that he went after her, but what does it mean? It means that he went after her. It means he went after her advice. He followed her, what she was telling him. And that's the meaning. That would be the meaning of it. And according to that, Manoach is not an Am Haaretz. So Rav Nachman Bar Yaakov thought Manoach is an Am Haaretz, and Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchok proved from the story, from a similar pasuk about Elisha, that he's not an Am Haaretz. Doesn't that, at least from that verse, you don't see such a thing. Rav Ashi says that that you for sure, this is a well-known rule, that you can't walk after, person can't walk after a woman, because we find the pasuk with Rivka that she and her maids, they went after Eliezer, and Eliezer went first. And the verse says they went after him and not before him. As it says they went after him, it sounds like it's emphasizing that they didn't go before him. And based on that, even children would know this is a obvious thing, that you can't afilu beirav nam, even children that study in cheder, they would know this thing, this rule, because you see it in the verse. And so the way that one of the commentaries mentioned, so what the Rav Ashi is trying to say is not that Manoach was really ignorant. He didn't even know something that little children know, but the opposite. That Rav Ashi is saying that Rav Nachman Bar Yaakov, who mentioned Manoach is an Am Haaretz, it can't be, because this is something that even children know. You for sure learned it wrong, and it must be, you have to explain it like Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchok explained it, that he went after her advice, but he didn't walk after her behind her. That would not be that you can't imagine that Manoach would have done that. So that's the way the Gemara seems to conclude with this story of Manoach. Now, the problem that the commentaries have on this is that there are sources that Manoach was a great tzaddik. He was similar to 31 tzaddikim, and different statements that brought in Sfarim. There's a Sefer Megadim Chadoshim that brings a number of sources that Manoach was quite a righteous person. Brings from Midrashim, Don Yodin Amoiza Manoach. He was a shayfet. Ushmai, the word Ushmai Manoach, the fact that any place, there's a medrash that says any place where it says Ushmai so-and-so, it says in his name is so-and-so, that is always a sign that we're dealing with a tzaddik. And here it mentions he was equal to that it also says the word Vayehi. Vayehi ish echad mitzara. It says Vayehi, and it was. Now the pasuk begins with Vayehi, and it says Ushmai Manoach, that it means that he was equal to Lamed Aleph Tzadikim, the equivalent of the word Vayehi. Vayehi that has a numerical value of 31. Therefore, means that Manoach was equal to 31 tzaddikim. So it sounds quite powerful statements about how righteous this Manoach was, and we find that for a wicked person, it says Golyas Shemoy, Novel Shemoy. That first it says their name, and then it says this was their name. In other words, Golyas was his name. That's by a wicked person. By a tzaddik, it says the opposite order, and his name was Manoach. And his name, that's how you find it mentioned about tzaddikim. Now, Ushmai Elkanah, and his name was Elkanah. So Ushmai Yishai, and his name was Yishai. So you see that he must have been a very righteous person. Now, so that sounds like it sounds like a big question on our Gemara. How could Rav Nachman Bar Yaakov think that he was an Am Haaretz? So the simple answer is that you do find sometimes that there's an argument between the rabbis, and these are two opinions. In other words, it doesn't say clearly either way, and each one is expounding upon the verses, and therefore there are midrashim chalukim. There are different opinions, and that's a very simple surface answer, because according to that, one of them is, at least in a practical way, is right, and the other one isn't, because was Manoach a tzaddik or not? But that is one way of explaining it, that there are sources this way, there are sources that way, and these are different midrashim. Another way of explaining it is in his relative to his generation that was full of idol worship, he was considered a tzaddik, but in truth, he was an Am Haaretz. In other words, it's not a contradiction that in his generation, similar to what we say about Noach, that in his generation he was a tzaddik, but not necessarily was he a tzaddik essentially. And another way of understanding it is that maybe he just didn't know this law, but he really was very righteous. He just happened to miss out on this law. And then the final point is a very interesting insight from the Ramah. The Ramah wrote a Sefer Teiras Ha'olah, And in this sefer, he has a lot of interesting insights. And he talks about the purpose of korbanos and so on. And he mentions the story of Manoach over there. And he says that Manoach was koroch achar ishta. He was, his mind, his activities, he was very involved in giving in to his permitted desire. What does that mean? There are certain things that we're not allowed to do, and there are certain things that we are allowed to do, but you're not supposed to indulge. So is cake permissible to eat according to Torah? It's kosher. It's kosher. Is steak, are you allowed to have steak? Yes, kosher steak, or why not? Would it be appropriate to have 3 steaks, or or would that be overdoing it? Well, that might not be acceptable. I don't know how big a person's appetite is, but that's indulging. Indulging is inappropriate. Same thing as having relations. Having relations is a mitzvah. But what about having relations every single night? Every single night is considered, like the term in the Gemara is that someone is with his wife like a tarnagon, like chickens. That I guess the way hens and roosters are together, they are constantly together, and I guess that's why the Gemara uses that example. And it's not appropriate for that's considered indulging. So the way the Ramah wants to explain, he says, even though our Gemara proves that Manoach was not really an Am Haaretz, because we just proved it from the other psukim, and the Gemara seems to conclude that it's probably not the interpretation that he was an Am Haaretz. But at the same time, even though it disproved it, there is still some element of truth. And he says, because in those days, everyone was indulging, and Manoach indulged in something permissible, and that's why it uses this term, that Manoach went after his wife. In other words, that's why Rav Nachman is mentioning it, because there was some element of sin there. And what was the element of sin? That he was not fulfilling the rule of being sanctifying oneself, of being a little holier and not indulging. There are things permissible, but it's not something it's not appropriate to indulge. And it could be learned from the pasuk Kedoshim Tiyu, that person should sanctify. You should be sanctified. You should be holy, and not to overly indulge in permissible pleasures. And so that is the understanding of the Ramah, that our Gemara doesn't totally disprove. It disproves the proof, but it seems to hint to this, and that's how the Ramah understands it. Now, so according to that, Manoach was maybe a tzaddik, but he did he wasn't up to par in one sense, that he took advantage of things that were permissible, even though he shouldn't have. And then comes the next Gemara, and the next Gemara we will read inside. We turn the page. I'm sorry, we don't turn the page yet. We are going to start the next Gemara 8 lines up from the bottom of the page. We're on 61a. 61a, 8 lines up from the bottom of the page. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, a person. Actually, I remember one thing I wanted to mention, and that is, so the story of Rivka going after Eliezer, her and her maids, they went after Eliezer. So was Eliezer Jewish? In other words, emphasizing the fact that she went after him, he didn't go after her. But if he wasn't Jewish, then who cares? He could have gone after her. He could walk behind her. She could have gone in front. And so what is the Gemara, how is the Gemara proving this? that you see clearly that the man is not supposed to walk after a woman, because Rivka went after Eliezer, implying that had it been permissible, maybe she would have walked in front of Eliezer and Eliezer would have walked behind her. Such a rule, I mean, if he's not Jewish, what does this rule mean? So the thing is, Eliezer was a very holy person. He was the servant of, he was considered an Eved Kanani. He was considered a servant that had a semi, he was obligated in mitzvahs as a Eved Kanani. The only thing is, he was before the giving of the Torah, so you can't say he was really obligated in mitzvahs, but he was fulfilling mitzvahs the way they should be. So that would be the understanding here that we're learning from his story, because he would have kept that law, being that he was Abraham's servant. And we do know also that Yafes Chasan shall Batei Avdei Avos Mitayrasin shall Banim, like Hashem loved his story. There's definitely we consider Eliezer to be in a high league, and obviously he was considered someone who would have followed what the Torah would say. So that is the story with following Rivka following Eliezer instead of Eliezer following Rivka. The Gemara continues, and again, we're 8 lines up from the bottom on 61a. A person should go after a lion better than going after a woman, because if you go after a lion, you're only going to lose out in this world. If the lion eats you up alive, you will die from this world, but at least you'll get the next world. But if you go after a woman, you lose the next world, because that's the punishment, is that you would lose your reward in the world to come. Better to go after a woman than to go after avodas kechavim umazolis, than going after an idol. And better to go after an idol than to go after a shul, the time that the shul is davening. Let me read this inside. Better go after a lion than a woman. Better go after a woman, not to go after idols. Go after idols. Not to go after behind the shul, at the time that the shul is davening, because it looks like you are rebelling against Hashem and you are throwing off your yoke of heaven, fulfilling mitzvahs. You're doing something that's degrading to the shul, to implying like you're not going to walk in. Now, v'loi amran ella deloi darimidi, and this doesn't apply unless you're not. This whole problem of walking behind the shul doesn't apply unless you have. It doesn't apply if you have the following 4 situations. Either you're carrying something. There's if there's another door, so you're passing by the back door, but that's not a problem because there is another door. It's not a problem if you're riding on a donkey, because probably you couldn't leave the donkey, would run away. And it's not a problem if you're wearing tefillin, because if you're wearing tefillin, obviously you are serious about running after mitzvahs, and you must have some reason why you're not entering the shul, but you're obviously not being mevatel the tefillah. You're not rebelling against Hashem and just not interested in davening. That's not the reason. You have your tefillin on. You're obviously very serious. So the Gemara here, let's read it inside. So this rule only applies if you're not carrying anything. If you're carrying something, doesn't apply. The was not said only in a case where you don't have another entrance. If there is another entrance, this doesn't apply. Not a problem to walk behind the door because there's another entrance, and people will think that maybe you're going to enter the other entrance. It's not mentioned only in a case where you're not riding on a donkey. If you're riding on a donkey, it's not about. Wasn't mentioned only in a place where you're not wearing tefillin. If you're wearing tefillin, this is not a problem. Then comes the next Gemara. Next Gemara mentions about the Yetzer Hara. So we're continuing to talk about the Yetzer Hara. Amar Rav. So this Gemara emphasized how bad it is to go after a woman, but it's even worse to go after an idol and to go behind the shul. Now the next Gemara mentions about the actual Yetzer Hara. Amar Rav Yetzer Hara. Rav says the Yetzer Hara is similar to a fly. And it dwells between the two entrances of the heart. That's where the fly, that's where the Yetzer Hara dwells. Shenemar, as it says, Zvuve Mavis Yavish is a fly of death. It causes a bad smell. Yabia Shemen Rekeach, it creates bubbles to perfumed oil, meaning the Yetzer Hara is just like a fly. Just like a fly, it can ruin. You have good oil, the fly dies in it, falls in it, and it gets ruined. Same thing is, you could be a righteous person, and the fly, the Yetzer Hara comes and could ruin your good deeds, could really ruin. You're very righteous, and then the Yetzer Hara just takes over and says, and gets you. All of a sudden, you're doing a lot of different sins. And so that's how the Yetzer Hara is. It could ruin good things. One of the commentaries says the reason why it's similar to a fly is because a fly always comes back. You shoo it away, and it flies right back. The Yetzer Hara is the same thing. Comes to you, and you overcome it. Then it comes back the third time, fourth time. It doesn't give up. Now, Shmuel says, Kamin, Chita Hudaim, it's similar to a piece of wheat, very small. Shenemar, as it says, the Pesach Chatas Revetz, and it's by the entrance, sin crouches. And here we just mentioned that the Yetzer Hara is standing by the entrance, and it says by sins, which is the same word as chita, wheat, chita in chatos, that it stands by the entrance. So implies that maybe what's standing by the entrance is not just sin is crouching by the entrance, but a chita, which symbolizes sin. It's from the same word, same source, same root word, chita, chet, that the wheat is standing by the entrance. And the idea is that even something very small, it could ruin your pure heart. And one of the commentaries mentions that this is connected to the idea that the opinion that the tree of knowledge was a piece of wheat. According to one opinion, eights could be wheat. Wheat could be it's called a tree. And so that opinion says that the tree of knowledge was a stalk of wheat. And that was the sin, that was the original sin. And that's connected to the Yetzer Hara, is basically like a piece of wheat. And somehow that's what, in other words, there's some obviously deeper meanings behind this, but that's what Shmuel was bringing out, that the Yetzer Hara is very similar to a piece of a stalk of wheat. And on a simple level, it's because it's so small, but yet it's very powerful. It's like a fly. It's like, well, the first opinion was it's like a fly. It's also very small, and but it keeps coming back. And this opinion is it's like a piece of wheat, and that's what that's yet it's there by the entrance, crouching, waiting to get you to sin. Of course, there's the idea of wheat. One of you mentioned, David mentioned that wheat is connected to either chametz, or wheat sours, like sourdough, and wheat also expands. It becomes leavened. It turns into chametz. So that's connected to this idea. Nice thought that Yetzer Hara is similar to wheat. It's interesting that it mentions that it stands in between the two gates of the heart. So one of the commentaries has an interesting insight that it dwells in between these two entrances, because really the Yetzer Tov is supposed to be on the right side of the heart, and the Yetzer Hara is supposed to be on the left side of the heart. But the Yetzer Hara doesn't stay where it's supposed to. It likes to take over and enclose itself in clothes that look like the Yetzer Tov, so it could trick you. And that's what happens a lot of times. The Yetzer Hara tricks you and convinces you to sin, not because it tells you to sin, but it tells you to do a mitzvah that is really a questionable mitzvah. For example, a very simple example would be a Yetzer Hara would tell you to stay up learning Torah late at night. But really, what the Yetzer Hara is getting you to do is to be irresponsible on saying Shema at the right time in the morning. Because if it gets you to learn tonight and it tells you should be learning more, you have more to accomplish, you should really be studying. But if that's going to get you to miss Kriya Shema in the morning, then really you should not be learning Torah late at night. And it's the Yetzer Hara that's telling you to learn Torah. You say, well, Yetzer Hara is telling me to learn Torah. This must be my Yetzer Tov. This must be my good inclination. It's getting me to learn Torah. And the answer is no. That the Yetzer Hara sometimes dresses up as the Yetzer Tov, and sometimes it's brought in Hasidic writings. It sometimes dresses up as if it's like a real Hasidisha, like a Hasidisha Yetzer Hara. You have a real Chassid with a long beard, long payas, big hat, a shtreimel, could tell you to do terrible things, good things, but ultimately they're leading to sin. So that is what it means, that it dwells in between the two openings, because it doesn't just stay in its place. It likes to hang out in a place that looks like it's the Yetzer Tov, looks like it's the good inclination. And this is the meaning of, there's a pasuk in one of the haftarahs that we read, haftarah about Leischa. It says, Satan oimed al yaminai lesitnai. The Satan was standing on the right side to cause him to sin. And this is surprising. What is the Satan doing on the right side? Should be on the left side. The answer is no. It sometimes dresses itself up as if it's like some mitzvah man. But really, it's a sinner. And that's this little Gemara about the Yetzer Hara. And then the Gemara mentions about the different organs of the person, what they do. It seems to be mentioning maybe a little about their spiritual sides, but it's interesting how the Gemara mentions their physical potential as well. Here, let's read the next two brises. There's two brises the Gemara brings. There's two kidneys in a person. One gives advice, good advice. One gives bad advice. It makes sense to say that the good advice is on the right kidney. And the bad advice is the left one. As it says, the heart of the chacham is to the right, and the heart of the fool is to the left. And what this means is that the heart is really the recipient of the advice that's given to it from the spleen, from the kidneys. So the kidneys give the advice to the heart, and the one that gives advice from the right is giving wise advice, and the one that gives advice from the left is giving foolish advice. And these are the two kidneys. Lev chacham leyamina. The lev, the heart, is receiving chachma from the right side, the right kidney, and the lev is receiving advice, foolish advice, from the left side. Okay, then the Gemara mentions Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis learned the kidneys do give advice. They give advice to the heart to do good or to do bad. Lev maven, the heart understands, decides like what to do. And the lashon is mechatech, the tongue. It seems to verbalize properly. It cuts the words. And peg goimer, the lips conclude the verbalization. Veshet machnis, the esophagus brings in the food. Kol minei meichel, all types of food. Kana moitzi, coil, the windpipe blows. It gives off sound. Reya shayeves, and the reya, which is the lungs, they absorb from the walls of the stomach. So somehow they draw, they pull, they vacuum, they pull some type of liquid, some type of a moisture into the reya, and they absorb kol mini mashkin, all types of liquid. Koyev kaved koyes, the liver gets angry. Mara zerekas by tipa, and the gallbladder actually throws bile, a drop of bile, to the liver, and it calms it down. Tchoil soichek, the tchoil, which is the spleen, it brings laughter. And according to another opinion, it means it grinds, but Rashi says laughter. And korkavan toichen, the korkavan, which is the gizzard, it grinds. And the keva is yeshena, the keva, the stomach, brings sleep, and af neir, the nose, brings awakeness. And neir hayashin, yashin haneir, if they switch jobs, the stomach wakes the person, and the nose brings sleep upon the person, nimaik v'hailachlai, he will wither and get worse and worse and weaker and weaker. Tana, we learned in a brisa a little differently. Im shnehem yeshenim, if both the nose and the stomach bring sleep. Oy shnehem neurim, or both of them bring awakeness. Miyad meiz, he would die right away. So this is the statement of different organs in the body, what they do. It's interesting that it mentions certain things about anger, where the anger is, and what calms the anger. The gallbladder sends bile to calm the anger that's in the liver. But it is interesting that this there is talk about the liver is one of the major organs that causes a lot of sickness. And here it mentions that the liver is the source of anger. A lot of interesting insights here. David mentioned about the Chinese medicine that the kidneys are connected to fear, and the GERD, and so therefore the idea of girding one's loins means one strengthens himself not to have fear. The liver brings anger. It mentions there in Chinese medicine as well. And the spleen is all about worry. And so if a person has a problem in the spleen, it could cause him to worry much more. And our Gemara mentioned that the spleen brings laughter, and that's the idea. If you have a healthy spleen, it would bring laughter, not worry. And so that's just insight. Thank you, David, for mentioning that. And then we have the Rashi, actually, the way Rashi has the Girsa in the Gemara, he has the Tana, the last 2 lines of the Gemara. The way he has it is that this is not really part of the Gemara, it's just a translation of the previous statement of the Gemara. So he has the previous statement of the Gemara, 2 translations of it. But ultimately, it's the same thing. Basically, our Gemara has it as a statement of its own, and it seems to be a additional brisa who learned it, had a different way of learning it. But that basically covers our Gemara. And I guess we'll stop here. We're on 61b. And we'll stop over here. Sei gesund.